Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Yari Gallegos, and I'm here with my colleague Jackie Thomas from your Northwestern Alumni Association. We will begin shortly, and we're so excited that Susan Corwith could join us for this great topic. First, we'll just cover a few quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the Ask Your Question box on the left-hand side of your webinar dashboard. We'll keep an eye out on those questions and ask a few of them at the end of the presentation. And then should you have any technical issues during the webinar, please refer to the Technical Issues tab. You should see that on the top end of your screen. Most issues can be resolved by just quickly refreshing your browser. And then lastly, a link to the recording of this webinar and a survey will be sent to all registrants after the talk. Now, I'm so excited to introduce Susan Corwith. Susan Corwith is the director of Northwestern University's Center for Talent Development and a national leader in talent development research and programming. She brings to this presentation decades of experience helping educators and families understand how strengths unfold over time and how to create opportunities that allow children to thrive in school and beyond. Now I'm going to hand it over to Susan. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Yari. I appreciate it, and appreciate this opportunity to continue the series. For those of you who were with us last week, welcome back. If you're new, that's wonderful too. The topics are connected, but they are not. You don't have to have the knowledge of the first session in order to hopefully walk away with some good information from this second session. But last week's session, I talked a little bit about how we identify strengths and interests, and I was talking largely about younger children and the idea of exploring and sort of discovering their interests. And now we're going to talk today about what are some foundational skills that are necessary for long-term talent development, and how do we go ahead and use or leverage their interests and strengths to build some of those skills. So I won't dive too much more deeply because I have a slide on goals for the session, but I will ask you along the way to do some joining in. By the chat is live, so when I ask some reflection questions, I hope you'll take a few moments to drop your thoughts in the chat. If there are things along the way that are of interest and you want to use a reaction, that's perfectly fine too. So we'll do our best to get through all of this in a timely manner and do it in a way that's engaging. Last week I did this too, but today I'm going to introduce myself somewhat in the context of the things we'll be talking about today, which are leveraging these interests and strengths and sort of building foundational skills. And I'll talk more about what that means in a few minutes. But for myself, if I think back, and I do a lot in my job, that's part of my job, is to look at my talent development pathway and the pathway of other people that we work with and how we can translate that to young people that we work with. My interest and strengths fell in kind of verbal and reading, writing skills, things like that. I love to read fantasy and mysteries. I love to doodle and write, and it was often for myself or for my family, but that was something that was very exciting to me. I also really loved to build and create and tinker. There was a lot of fixing around the house, designing, or doing things and taking things apart. Whether that made my parents happy, I can't tell you, but it was something I really enjoyed and learned a lot from. And then that, I think, as I look now at those interests and academic strengths as a through line, there was a lot of problem solving, investigation. I was pretty good at reading text and comprehending that and being able to sort of summarize and share that back out. And when I looked then at my college and career pathway, I had a lot of family that was in education. I sort of followed that pathway, focusing on middle and high school students, and going through first English language arts, then narrowing in on a reading specialist degree, and then eventually also a gifted education degree. So really, when I look at those foundational skills that help me get where I am, things that stand out to me were sort of level of persistence and focus, some flexibility. And I think part of that was we moved around a lot when I was younger. And so I had to sort of come in and out of environments quite a bit, got kind of flexible with things, as well as different perspective taking. So I'm sharing all that with you because that's going to speak to some of our goals for the session. That by the end of today, I hope that you will really understand some of these, what I'm calling ingredients, that our students, our children need to thrive, that come from CTD's talent development approach and what we have called our framework for success, which I'll share a little bit more with you about that in a couple minutes. I want you to see how strengths and interests can really drive talent development and how we utilize that as our children get older so that they can start to use those themselves. We want to recognize how interests and skills can be leveraged to build these foundational academic and psychosocial skills. And when I say academic, I'm thinking more domain specific, subjects that your students or your children are learning in school, and then sort of apply a few very practical strategies. And if you were with me last week, they really are tied to day-to-day activities or things that you can just put a little more time or attention into to just strengthen the opportunities that your children have to build their motivation, their resilience, and self-advocacy. Okay. All right, we are to that opening reflection time. So I want to set the stage for our discussion by having you think about, and if you're comfortable, sharing your perspectives and experiences. So I have two questions. And the first question is really to have you, it's not really a question, what I would like you to do is share 3 or 4 skills or behaviors that you think are important for success in life as you are defining success. I'm not going to give you a set definition. I want you to sort of think about success in your own terms. And what are sort of 3 or 4 skills or behaviors that you think are important for success? You can drop those in the chat. And hopefully others will watch and respond accordingly, put their own thoughts. You'll start to see some themes coming in here. Okay. Okay. Great. Seeing them pop. I know it takes a little time for people to type and put things in there, but now I see them popping up. Thank you so much. So when we think about these 3 or 4 skills or behaviors, I'm seeing curiosity, open communication, deliberate, being caring. Persistence is coming up a fair amount, as is, let's see, being intentional and disciplined, focused. Okay. Yeah, reframing your thoughts. Okay. I'm glad to see in here both some of these pieces about, persistence and focus that we have to sort of control, but also how we engage with others, having some balance, how we're accepting and learning from our mistakes, how we're interacting with other people and making sure we're doing that in a way that's supportive. Great. Thank you so much. Remember some of these things, watch for some of these themes because they're going to show up again in a couple of minutes. The second piece of this reflection is now, to what extent do you still have to practice these skills or behaviors to keep them sharp or ready for use effectively? Now, this can make us feel kind of vulnerable, but I'm going to go ahead and say that we're all learning to some extent, but I'd love to just have you think, especially as we're going to be talking about your children or other children that you work with, young people, you know, do you still have to practice? How much do you have to practice these skills? How often do you have to remind yourself to kind of pay attention to these things? Whatever you're kind of comfortable sharing, that'd be great to share, but otherwise, at least reflect on that yourself as we think about some of the strategies we're going to use with young people. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Consistent practice. It is that mindset of always having to learn and grow. It's daily. It's constant. Yeah, and I think, I'm not looking for any particular answer. Each of us lives, navigates the world in different ways with different strengths and kind of interactions. But I think the message has to be that it is probably going to be pretty consistently that we have to practice these things or we have to call our attention. But surprisingly, our children do, I don't know that it's that surprisingly, but our children don't always recognize that these things have to be practiced. These skills have to be built up. We have to sort of be introduced to them in different ways at different times and come back to them. And so part of what we're going to be talking about in terms of strategies is how do we make that visible to the young people we have in our lives every day. But let's start with this talent development framework again. CTD, always paying attention to the talent development framework, because it's really where we, in the programs that we put together and in how we work with parents and how we work with schools, help talk about these different pieces that students need, these ingredients that students need to thrive. Now, some of the skills and behaviors we just identified in our reflection fall in the optimal challenge category of what we need for our talents to develop, and you'll see sort of the 2 pieces there. But many fall in the psychosocial skills category, the support there. And what the most recent talent development research tells us is that these psychosocial skills are even more significant than we previously realized. But the really good news in that is that most of these skills and behaviors can be taught, and they definitely can be practiced. We can develop them and learn them. And they are not sort of a set of traits that we either have or we don't. Doesn't mean our personalities don't differ or that we sort of have different internal drives and skill sets, but that we're not all sort of born with a set of traits that's the end of the story, right? We may be more inclined towards some behaviors and approaches. We may feel more confident in the way we do certain things, but we aren't sort of stuck in just one mode. So these are skills that need to be practiced, and I only have 4 of them up on the screen right now. It's just sort of as an example of what we're talking about. But the optimal challenge piece is what we talked a little bit about last time. How do we make sure our students are, in a space where they are being asked to try new skills, gather new knowledge, apply different resources, ask for help in different ways, right? That's how our talents develop. Okay. Now, based on the research on learning, non-cognitive factors necessary for achievement and talent development. Center for Talent Development, maybe 2017, 16, 17, somewhere in there, created its first framework for success, which is really just a conceptual guide for thinking about how we prepare curriculum, instruction, and give feedback or work through evaluation processes. So it's a guide to what talent development needs to become fully formed in adulthood. And we just reworked the framework. The first round of the framework was a good first step for helping us really think about how we were approaching this work. This new framework takes in the most current research and more of our years of practice and feedback from students, families, and educators. And what you see here are the categories of skills and behaviors that we've identified. And these skills and behaviors are ones that drive academic, career, personal, and community success. And these sort of, the different skills and behaviors will interact and kind of go across different categories. But I'm going to take a few minutes to walk you through each of these categories. Okay, so when we think about foundational skills and behaviors by category, the first category that we've identified is academic behaviors. And this is what we would call sort of showing up and doing the work, right? We have to be able to, when a child goes into a learning environment at school, they're learning to self-regulate their emotions. In home, they have to do that a little bit differently. Outside of school, at clubs or other activities, they also have to sort of know how they're feeling, what's expected in that environment. They're going to show up and figure out how to get the work done by doing, spending some time with focus and persistence, building up automaticity. That's why we spend time in school with, math facts and vocabulary words and things like that, so that you don't have to be regularly spending cognitive time drawing on that, trying to figure out what's happening. We're building some automaticity and becoming more autonomous learners. So if we can sort of be in these learning environments, we're starting to understand and develop this set of skills. The next category is the adaptive perseverance skills. Sort of this idea of sticking with it even when things feel different or new or unique. So I had mentioned I feel like I've learned some flexibility. This would fit in this category of sticking with it. We can be flexible and sort of take what's coming, building up some coping strategies for when things are moving, changing, when things are feeling more stressful, when there are sort of deadlines or expectations that are new. In this category is motivation, learning what that feels like, how to build your sort of internal drive as well as use external cues and supports to help. And then some tolerance for pressure or discomfort. Understanding the difference between what it means to just feel a little bit under pressure or a little bit uncomfortable as opposed to being unsafe in that environment or a risk that's not worth taking, right? So how do we sort of help our children understand that, use that language, and be able to stay in a situation? Other foundational skills and behaviors, they fall in the academic mindsets category. What we mean by academic mindsets can kind of fall under this theme of beliefs that power our learning. Okay? What is it that helps us keep going and understand what learning really looks like? Well, there's some confidence in there that's really based on self-efficacy, a sense that I have the ability, I have the tools I need to make things happen or to be able to, sort of power through new information, right? Another really interesting piece of this is optimism and hope. Dante Dixon at Michigan State has done a lot of really interesting work on the importance of optimism in being able to sort of get through challenges and to continue on your talent development pathway. This is also about comfort with difference from norms. There are sort of norms in school, norms at home, but sometimes we do things differently, or things will change, or the expectations are different, and we can be comfortable with that. Or we meet different people, we're in different groups with different perspectives, experiences, and so on. So how do we get comfortable with that difference? And then being able to embrace opportunity, or seeing the opportunity in challenges that arise in front of us. So we see that as an opportunity rather than something that's going to stop us from going forward. So those are all really important academic mindsets that we can help our children develop and think about. Then we move on to strategic learning skills, learning how to learn. What does it mean to learn? What are those skills in doing that? Well, coachability is a really big one. And this comes out of a lot of really good and interesting research on elite athletes. How did they sort of get to where they are? What were some of the most important pieces of their development? And they talk a lot about coachability. And we think about that as being able to take in information from those who are more expert, from mentors, from teachers, from peers who are involved in the work that we're doing, and understanding which information is really important to adapt to and to take in, and when maybe I'm going to stick by my idea and give it a try and see how that goes, because that's how we get novel things, right? How we innovate as well. Goal setting is a piece of this. The learning how to learn is, where am I now? Where do I need to go next? How do I get there? Smart risk taking. This is another one that's coming to the forefront as being really important, particularly as we understand innovation and change, that understanding when it's worth taking that risk. And everyday learning involves, risks. You might not have the right answer. The, the thing the building you're building might topple over if you're, in your Legos. If you have some grand plan for how you're going to, create this video and it doesn't turn out quite right because we're using some new tools, that's okay. You took the risk to try a new technology and maybe it just didn't turn out quite right. But there are smart risks in our learning that move us forward. And that's tied to then the next piece of this category, which is metacognition. So can I think about and understand the way I learn and how learning happens? And then can I sort of, again, share that out or use that to move me into the next phase of what I need to learn? We're into the last three categories, two here and then one more. These thinking skills, being able to engage, analyze, innovate using analytical reasoning, evidence-based argumentation, really important, learning and understanding what a hypothesis is and how to test that out, and then being able to take on different perspectives. Now, each of these skills and behaviors show up at different times. Our very, very young children are going to have a harder time with perspective taking. They're just not developmentally quite there yet. But by the time we have middle school and high school students, they certainly should be able to take different perspectives. Doesn't mean we can't introduce the idea of perspective taking early on or hypothesis testing early on, using that language and, sort of moving our children along. But for them to fully enact it, it doesn't show up a little bit until later. Under social skills, the people and communications pieces, social awareness. And this is not necessarily that, they're going to be become more, extroverted or sort of out in front of people, but knowing what's happening in different situations, knowing that, sort of social interactions take place in different ways at different times. How we engage might depend on who we're in the room with or who we're working with, but just sort of building those skills and behaviors of awareness of that. And then that's related to networking as well, and understanding how when you're, working on a science project or you're working in a lab or even as a writer and you're working with, an editor, who are the people in the network that you have to know and that can either help support your work or will sort of help you, continue to grow in that field. And as we get older, we're looking for people in the network who can introduce us to, apprenticeships or internships or help us through choices in a college major or, getting placed in a business in the first part of their career, getting to know people so you can understand what jobs they're in. So that networking becomes very important. And it's something that we have to be thoughtful about too, about who has access to those networks and who we need to invite to have access because they might not know that it's available to them or an important piece of what's going on. And that also ties to empathy, understanding who we're working with, other people's ideas, having an understanding of what people might be experiencing or feeling and responding in the ways that we can using adaptive communication skills. So are we working with friends? Are we working in a more formal professional situation? Are we introducing ourselves to completely new people? How are we adapting our communication to those different situations and environments? So as you see, there are a lot of these different skills, and we will practice them and sort of engage them at different points along the way. This final category is really not as much about the psychosocial skills, but it is about understanding that each domain that we work in, and when I'm talking about K-12 school, we're talking things as simply as sort of science, math, English language arts, things like that. But we're understanding what's going on in that domain, what exists there, and how that domain leads to later outcomes, what people do in those roles, what kind of impact that has, both for you now, but also in the future. So what do you know about that content? How are you building that content knowledge? And the second piece of that is that kind of related to the networking piece as well, is that tacit knowledge. When you spend time in a science lab, you learn how people function in a science lab. You see what works, what doesn't, the rules, the safety, things like that. But if you're never in that space, you aren't necessarily going to pick up all of those just kind of things that don't show up in the book, right? Or in the content that's put in front of you. So how do we get our young people into spaces where they get a chance to see what's happening in these domains and get connected to people who can give them sort of that inside understanding of what to expect? Also in this category, we have ethical self-advocacy. So how do I promote my interests, my abilities, get moving on my talent development pathway in a way that's supportive of the people around me and others who will be working in this field as well? And how do I think about the work that I do in the long run, having an impact, not just for me, your own personal development is important, but you work in a community, you live in a family, you have a society, and you're part of a global, community as well. So what are the things that we're doing that have an impact for good or for maybe not so good, and how do we address that? Okay. So those are what I mean by foundational skills, and those are falling in that psychosocial skill, support for psychosocial skills in the talent development formula. So we're going to talk about sort of the flow is identifying and understanding our children's and our interests and strengths and using them to help develop foundational skills that we just talked about that we know are important, and that by doing that, we continue on this talent development pathway. Okay. It's not a simple process. It happens in fits and starts all the time, and there are many decision points along the way. But I think it's helpful to understand conceptually how this works, because that makes our choice of actions and our end goals a little bit clearer, and we can certainly help our children understand that as they go along. Okay. We've reviewed the foundational skills and behaviors critical to learning and growth and talent development over the lifespan. Pretty soon I'm going to transition to the how we can support our children in developing these various skills at developmentally appropriate times and in supportive ways. But our work starts with cycling back to this topic of the session last week on identifying interests and strengths. My message last week was about using strengths and interests to identify pathways for lifelong learning, including career and vocational pathways. This week, my message is more about building these critical psychosocial skills by utilizing some of those strengths and interests to the extent possible. Before we touch on strategies, I'm going to ask you to do another brief reflection exercise, focusing on the statement I have up on the screen here. And first, I'd like you to sort of share in the chat, to the extent that you're willing to do that, how you see interests and strengths, or how you think interests and strengths are engines for growth. Okay, because the statement is interests and strengths are not extras. They're powerful engines for growth, particularly sort of in this psychosocial skill development bucket. I shared with you a couple of my broad interests and academic strengths and some of the psychosocial skills that I identify as engines for growth. And as I think about them, I can trace how they connect to the work that I do. So that's really what I'm asking, if you can, what are sort of those interests and strengths? How are interests and strengths engines for growth? Great. Okay. Let's get a couple more ideas in here. I'll give it a little bit more time. And part of the purpose for me asking this is for you to start to see some through lines or connecting points between the things that you like and feel you do well and the skills you sort of use in your day-to-day life, professionally or personally, and how we can then think about how we share that out and help our children make those connections as well. Okay. Yeah. Okay, yeah, certainly where interest is, your focus gets sustained. And I always like to use the example, I think it's an easy one, we hear about it all the time, is how many of our children will sit for hours in front of, a video game or with a video game, even though their character dies over and over and over. But there's something in it that's interesting and exciting to them. You would say the same with me with a book. The world could be, sort of going crazy around me, but I'm so focused on it. So that focus is there. Oh, good. I like the word engines. Yeah, they really do drive, it's sort of that momentum, right? It's momentum building. Yes, I love building curiosity, increases your learning. Yeah, and very helpful socially when other people share those similar interests and strengths. You are building off each other, and that building off each other is motivation, and you're learning all through that process. And that's again when we talk about the programming we do at the center, trying to find idea mates, intellectual peers. There are lots of different terms, but people who challenge each other in complementary ways. So great. I appreciate you taking that time. Yeah, well. It's the video games. We hear so much about that, and positive or negative. I'm not going to get into that, but it's certainly a good example of getting in the flow and being willing to go with the punches or go with it. All right. So, kind of why interests and strengths matter to skill building. Well, you were just sharing with me some of your thoughts, and I agree, and it's much of what we talk with families about at the center. But I want to call out a couple of important things, just good reminders, I think, that as a tool of learning, our interests and strengths really do spark that entry in. If we know our child is struggling with a particular skill, maybe it is sometimes focus, or maybe it is being organized about something. If we can spark their entry into doing that work through something that's of interest to them or a strength that they have, that's going to just move us ahead a little bit faster. It's going to sustain that effort when the challenge gets harder. And it's going to shape sort of the identity that they have, seeing themselves more as, I see myself more as a writer, or I see myself, as potentially a scientist, and some of the choices that they're making. And then developmentally, these strengths and interests encourage that exploration and curiosity, which it was really great to see those themes popping up in your early reflections. And that effort for skill building, that's where the skills grow, is in continuing to persist and keep trying it. That commitment and developing expertise are also really important. So when we introduce kind of new learning or address areas for improvement, the goal is to start from a strength as much as possible. We can't always do that, but to the extent that we can. When children learn through their strengths and interests, their brains really don't have to work as hard to keep up, right? They don't have to focus on all these other things. Instead, they have more mental energy to think deeply, to focus on the problem at hand, and sort of stick with the challenge. So I do, like this connection here, thinking about it like this, that when it's connected to something they already know and love, their brain is using a well-paved road rather than sort of having to hack through unfamiliar terrain where they're paying attention to I often think about if you're handed a new piece of tech, and you're told right away you have to do that to access something that's important for you to do at work. You're spending a lot of mental energy figuring out how that piece of equipment works before you can even get to the content that you're supposed to be working on, right? But when I say the well-paved road versus the unfamiliar terrain, I want to clarify that a well-paved road is not something that's easy to travel necessarily. So I did select this photo purposefully, that it's a little bit windy and hilly, because there are still challenges. We want that optimal challenge, but we don't want too many distractions when they're trying to learn something new. Okay, so a few tips. We're transitioning to some ways you can encourage your child to develop the skills that they need by leveraging their interests and strengths. But let's start with a couple of tips. So first, think of your child's abilities as a tool for their development, and as much as possible, not a reward, right? So encouraging them to pick activities and clubs and pastimes at home that they find compelling, that will challenge them in new ways, the right level of difficulty or stretch. And while we can certainly use some of their likes for short terms, extrinsic motivators, withholding the activities that fuel their excitement or minimize their opportunities to engage in interest-based activities so that they can focus just on areas of need really does have a longer term negative impact. So how do we just making sure to balance giving them a chance to do the things that they love, spend time with the things that they're really good at, so that they can bring some of that energy over in when they are doing things that are less, comfortable for them or harder for them or less interesting to them. Second, the foundational skills really grow best when they're aligned with motivation, whether that's intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation, just some form of motivation. And seeing how often you can get your child to the peak of their learning zone in the activities that they're interested in, the ones that are interesting to them. So they're more apt, again, to stick with the challenge and seek out coping strategies in that situation. And if they're seeking out coping strategies, then they're learning those, and then our job is to help them transfer those later on. Third bullet point here, interest-driven tasks can be leveraged to make the setbacks that they experience, which they will experience, hopefully a little more palatable. Failing or struggling in that context can be, a little more easily reframed as part of learning and getting more skilled or expert when they're in the mindset of this is something that I'm willing to do. I'm going to keep trying because it's interesting to me. So use the experience to talk about what skills, strategies, or resources they need or they're using to keep going. And then that metacognition, reflecting on the experience afterward and asking how they might apply those similar strategies in other situations, or helping them when they are struggling in those other situations. And that connects to the final tip on the slide, which is really to, help coach your children to articulate their needs for support, right? They need to know that it's okay to ask for guidance and help when they encounter difficulty. They can use their networks, which is why these idea mates and intellectual peers are so valuable as our mentors that you can connect them to. And they need coaching to use their resources and abilities. So if they are struggling with something, it's okay to say, I'm having a hard time with this. But the response is not to come to you and say, I'm having a hard time, do it for me. It's to come and say, hey, this is the thing I'm struggling with. Can you help me figure it out? Or for you to be able to say, hey, is there resources you can use, or is there something we can do together, to make sure they keep that control or keep that self-efficacy in the process. But for them to be able to use that language. For a lot of the kids that we work with in particular, they're working in an area of strength and they're working at a very high level. They're like an advanced challenge for a student identified as gifted or advanced in a particular subject area. They can be very afraid to say that they need support or that they need help. So we need to do a lot of coaching in the background to make that more normalized and regular. Okay, so switching to a few more sort of strategies or things that we can work on. Interests change how much and how long we can focus. I've already mentioned that. You've put some of that in the chat. Because when they care about what they're learning, they're going to wrestle with those ideas. Their attention supports long-term understanding. And this is also a time when you can start to figure out how well your children are able to attend and focus. And if they are struggling, there may be something else going on. And so that's another thing for us to explore and figure out what kind of additional help they might need with that. So at home, to the extent that you can, in a busy, full schedule with multiple children sometimes, but to notice when your child persists and under what conditions they're doing that. to help them reflect on why. So maybe not in the moment while they're right in it, but as they're finishing up to sort of ask them, wow, it really looked like you were into that. Tell me, how did that feel? What was going on? Why were you so, why did it have your attention? And then look for opportunities to transfer what they discover into different situations, or when they're going into something that isn't going to be quite as compelling, to help them look for some value in or outcomes of their efforts, and how that might help them when they go back to do the other things that they are excited about. Okay, interests and strengths can really help reduce stress and shut down, because all of our children are going to shut down at some point. We ourselves shut down at some point over different things. But that sort of anxiety or frustration really drains energy before we can even begin to learn. So if we have the opportunity to call to the forward, our strengths, or connect something to how we're going to be, using it later that's of interest, let's provide that context and make it less overwhelming. Let's reduce, as I was saying, that cognitive load or that extra noise that interferes with students' thinking. And really, it helps them stay regulated when tasks get more difficult or complex. So at home, if your child is feeling overwhelmed, or it seems to be feeling overwhelmed or anxious about something that they're doing, or some homework that they have, or whatever it is, let's start by reconnecting what they're doing to something more familiar, something they've already done and done pretty well, or something more favorited, before we keep pushing for them to keep going, before they're working on mastery. But we want to keep their attention on mastery and not the final performance or outcome, and use that experience again in other settings where they felt success after struggle. So how can we get back into that mindset of when I felt success and how did I get there? Now, when they're having a really strong reaction and moment, we can't do all this right away, right? We need to give it a little time and then come back to it. Interests and strengths really do help speed up skill fluency. They can master routine skills more quickly, and sometimes that's really needed. There's certain reading skills and writing skills and kinds of calculations and technology, whether it's using particular softwares or types of equipment, that the more practice that they get, the better they are, the more confident they are with it, the more automatic the behaviors are. And that's really important when they're getting started in areas of study, so that when they get to high school, when they get to college, all of those skills are pretty well set, and they're strong. So the brain can free up the space that they need for more analysis and innovation, creativity, things like that. So let's go ahead and allow for some repetition and practice with activities that your children enjoy. It's not really wasted time if they keep doing it, if they are building some efficiency and setting the stage for, something that will carry over into other, domains or other activities that they may get involved with in the future. So I get that question a lot. Should I let my child keep doing this thing? They spend hours doing it. It's like, well, yeah, as long as it's not interfering with other parts of their lives or the ability to sort of transition. But they're also, building some skills in doing that, and that's not a bad thing. We also get a lot of questions about sort of bumps in the road or times when motivation and self-advocacy stall. So let's just spend a couple of minutes looking at this and thinking about this. So we can use strengths and interests as some scaffolding. We don't want to abandon them. We want to help your children independently lean on their strengths and their interests when they come to learning tasks that are more difficult. And this sometimes takes some reframing for them, because they may or may not know some of their strengths, but you've observed it, or someone, their teacher has observed it. So strong verbal skills, someone with strong verbal skills, but struggles with the task of writing for any number of reasons. Well, we can let them talk their ideas out first, right? We can encourage them to sort of use that strength of verbal ability to put some ideas in order, to make things, ready for that writing task. We can record their ideas and their explanations and then clean it up a little bit and help them turn that into writing. Or we can use technology to capture ideas and organize themes for them. There are different, softwares they can use in different ways that then help them transition into the writing that's a little more difficult for them. If you have a child who has really strong visual spatial skills, but perhaps is struggling with the idea of more, abstract concepts, or, there are other, more concrete things that are kind of problematic for them, Well, we can allow them to use diagrams and sketches and color coding to organize things in using what they do well and what comes a little more naturally to then transition into pulling ideas together, figuring out the basic, the concepts that they need to understand. So how do they use graphic organizers to get their thoughts and make sure they understand what's happening? If you have a child with very strong quantitative skills, they can do a lot of, numbers and manipulation or things like that, but sometimes they have a hard time with their process or, sort of taking that into other domains. Well, let them go ahead and do that process. We don't necessarily want to stop those calculations from going on, but then they can recreate the process with you, talk you through it, and then help them figure out how to translate that. They can use manipulatives to begin with and sort of show that process and then figure out how to write that process out or do that process. Certainly a little more time consuming, but we get more progress and they start to realize how they can do the same task, but with a different point of view or a different approach to it. And finally, perhaps we have a child who's got really strong hands-on or building skills, adolescents this way as well. They don't really like paper and pencil tests. They don't like having to, get to that final piece. Well, let's start with those models, those demonstrations using physical materials or movement first, and then again, sort of switch to the technology and to the things that they actually have to, put in place. But allowing them to do, work from the mode that they're most comfortable with and that they sort of see success in and reframing it and building, for themselves then the next level of skills. And sometimes when it comes to sort of waning motivation, we're going to get to sustaining effort and motivation. That when your child is engaging in activities for long stretches, ask them what they're liking about that, why they keep going, exploring what strategies they're using. And then you can come back to them and they can come back to those examples when they're struggling to sustain their effort and activities. And there's, my husband likes to tell the story of how he would spend hours in his backyard on his, basketball, shooting baskets or shooting hoops, particularly free throws, over and over and over, hours and hours. And he recalls and shares conversation with his mom, who originally was like, why are you out there doing that? What? And they eventually he just reflected on it. He didn't want to have to think about it. Like it was slowing down his game if he, wasn't able to but to sort of keep his motivation going. It actually was great for him to spend a lot of time out there doing this in the backyard, which was interesting to him, but it also built the skills that he needed to do what he wanted to do when he was with his team. So the same thing was sort of building the largest, Lego tower, and when it sort of falls over, figuring out what strategies they're using and why they're willing to persist in it. So if we can use that, we can also use extrinsic motivators. So intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, I like to say they're not two ends of a continuum. They can coexist even within a task, but they are related to different sort of starting points or factors or drivers that we want to use. And so those extrinsic motivators, when used short term as a means to get to the next step, can be very helpful. So whether your children kind of do that themselves or you set that up for them or their teacher sets it up for them to get to the next stage of work, that can be a good thing to get past a hump. When we think about sustaining effort and motivation, sort of those dips are going to be part of development, and they're going to be these different stall points. And I have on the slide here a few reasons why we hit stalls. Sometimes it's too much information or it's too overwhelming. So learning how your child reacts, or it gets harder with teenagers sometimes to figure out when they're just overwhelmed or when they truly are bored. But if you can, observe different behaviors in different settings, ask them about that, get them to articulate that. It's important because how we approach the difference between too much information, too new, versus not enough, we're going to do some different things. It might be that they're doing more comparison or competition with peers and they're reacting to that and they're sort of stalling in their own development because they're too busy worrying about what other people are doing. Or what they're doing is lost its novelty, right? They've come to sort of the end of the road in it, either because they don't know where to go next, that is something, an extension of that, or they're just kind of ready to move on in their, it's just not the interest that it used to be. So determining the cause really will get to the approach. Like, do you need to provide some more resources or some scaffolding skills to fill in some gaps that they have? Or do we need to level up the challenge, find some peers who are a little more expert than they are, find some classes at school that are the next level of rigor because they are not getting the challenge that they need. If it comes to kind of the competition with peers, helping them reframe their goals or refocus their goals on mastery. How can they set goals that are not about what other people are doing? That's a hard one to do, especially in adolescence, because so much of it is about sort of social interaction and social needs. But there are ways to do that, and making sure that the teachers, the mentors, the coaches are supportive of them in that way. And it might be that sometimes it's time to find a different interest or related opportunity, but helping them sort of close out the current, whether it's club or activity or team that they're on, before they start to investigate what's next. The really big one is this normalizing struggle when your child does hit a plateau or gets frustrated, to share your stories of effort and growth or others. It sounds like sort of a simple thing or sometimes an odd thing, but even having them read about people that they think are pretty amazing, people who have been innovators or experts. If you read through their biographies, learn about their pathway, you're going to find a lot of struggle in there, and helping them understand that that's really part of the process. But making time for reflection, for stepping away, for redirecting for the moment, to do something they do like for a little while and come back. But that constructive feedback that looks at, hey, you're working hard. I can see that you've made some progress. Now it's feeling a little bit different. What should we do next? How can I help you keep going? Right? Okay. All right, we're into the final slides here before we get to questions and answers. Um, but the goal setting is, I'm going to come back to that as a really important piece, particularly for our middle school and high school students. Getting them to set goals tied to improvement, things that they can manage and control, that will help them continue to develop many of these skills that we've talked about. But to really help them think about just even one skill they want to improve, or one thing that they want to understand more deeply, more fully, spend more time learning about, and then getting them in a plan to do that, right? Something that they can sort of mark their progress and then build their next goal, so that will help them into the future. Few sort of things to watch for or to avoid as we're helping our children think about and build those foundational skills. We want to avoid focusing on their deficits all the time, right? A lot of kids, particularly when they're maybe having a hard time in school in a particular subject, they spend so much time on those areas for improvement. So let's move away from some of that remediation to some time for them to really focus on their strengths and get deeply into subjects that are exciting to them. It helps when they do have to get back to the piece of improvement, right? Let's try not to fight our child's interests and see them as distractions, right? Sometimes they can get to that point. Again, if they're sort of pulling from other things that they need to do day to day or within the family or within school. But to the extent possible, giving them that time and letting them sort of spend that energy on it is really good. And understanding them in that moment, what can you learn from watching them or hearing from them as they do those things? And then again, staying away from just giving them time to work on their interest as a reward, because that does backfire in the long run. And then we don't want to overstructure our child's time either. It feels sometimes, particularly in middle school and high school, as they're preparing for the future, that they have to do a little bit of everything, and that it has to be formal. But it really doesn't. They need to sort of choose the things that sustain them and that keep them focused, get them on a path where they can show some depth of experience, and that they choose and make some of those decisions with you, to give them that efficacy and control that they're looking for. And here's where I'm going to wrap up before the questions and answers, but that the long-term goal, when we talk about talent development, when we present this kind of information to families and to students themselves, that we want our students to see themselves as capable, self-driven learners, not just they're good at these certain things, right? They can certainly do a lot of things well, but we want them to just be more grounded as capable, self-driven learners. All right. And I do have some information on CTD programs that if we get through questions and answers, I can come back to specifically, but I'd love to just take some time for questions and answers.
Thank you, Susan. So we have a few questions here, and then if anyone here has a question as well, please feel free to either drop it in the chat or there's a Q&A option at the bottom of the screen, and we can go ahead and read those off. The first question here is, when thinking about the importance of social skills and the importance of social relationships in our children's lives, how can we help a child whose interests are very different from their peers so they don't experience isolation?
Okay. And I'm going to have to make a couple of assumptions maybe about what peers are. We can think about different peer groups. I'm going to maybe assume that the question is about peers of the same age or maybe in the same grade level. And that can be difficult because, in the work that we do at the center, we have a lot of kids they have interests that are either more at a more advanced level or in a subject area that other kids have not yet even been exposed to, wouldn't necessarily even know exists. So it is really important to sort of find that community, whether that's, starting with some of our folks at the center to sort of say, hey, are we aware of, opportunities or groups out there? The internet has become a helpful place for that now that particularly, if there's anything good that came out of our COVID experience, it is that there's more communities that grew up online and places to find some of that. And I think it's important to use that language of peers being more than just someone your same age. Coming to a program like CTDs, and there are, several of them around the country and even around the world, you do get a chance to share that interest with someone closer to your age. But you don't have to be with someone your age. It can be someone who's just sharing that same interest. So how do we find that? Even if it means, your child maybe isn't quite the same age as some of the other people doing that activity, that's okay, if that community will allow them to be there. So they can build that social engagement and build that network in that community with those others. It doesn't have to just be that same age. But that's why organizations like ours, I think, one of the reasons we exist is to help create that space.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Mhm.
And then you mentioned technology here, but we have another question in that similar space. You mentioned video games earlier. Can you speak to how we can leverage this as an interest along with any other technology like watching TV, social media in healthy and manageable ways?
Yeah, the healthy and manageable ways is something that a lot of research is happening on right now, right? And I actually have a tag or flag tag in my um, that I get alerts through Google about these things and just the research that's coming and the concern about that. Um, from our point of view, our experience with talent development, if there is an interest, particularly in how the technology works or being engaged in some of those communities, we do have to have those conversations with children, particularly middle school students, late elementary, middle school, high school, about how they're feeling when they're in those spaces, what's compelling them. When I was saying, asking them why they're there, and if it starts to feel that that's like a negative thing, or they're focusing too much on some of those comparisons or what they have or don't have compared to others, that's when I start to worry. But if they really are, interested in some of those things, they're connecting with people that are, fueling them in positive ways. There isn't technology itself isn't just a bad or good, right? It's how are we using it? How often are they using it? How often are they able to transition from one activity to another and keep going? So I think it's, we try our best in the courses and the programming that we do to balance that so that they know how the technology works, where they can make use of, how they can find other communities, but then to know those limits.
Yeah, thank you. And then we have one last question here, related to goal setting. So when setting goals with our children, would you recommend getting very specific with strategies and potential roadblocks, or is there a balance here, so the plan itself doesn't become overwhelming?
Yes, that's really good. There's always this level of balance, right? And with younger children in goal setting, we're talking about usually pretty specific and simple, like you're going to do they're going to do their homework for 10 minutes or 15 minutes before they take a break or something like that, right? But as they get older, their goals will be a little more complex because it's going to be a few steps in that process before they get to the end. But we do want in goal setting to make sure it is a time-bound and clear step that they are going for so that they can achieve that and figure out how to do the next thing. If it gets too detailed and too complex, they're not going to be able to follow through on it. So it's going to be a little trial and error of figuring that out. But that's
Oh,
why some of
no.
the tools that are out there are really good, like the SMART goals and the WHOOP approach are two really good places to start.
No, absolutely. No, thank you so much for that, Susan. And would you like to share some of CTD's current resources with us?
Sure, yeah, I can do that. And if there are further questions, again, the Q&A, or we're still kind of watching the chat, so I don't want to overlook any of that. But we do often get questions about the program, so I just want to touch on those again quickly. We've talked, the series really focuses on interests and strengths and talent development. And so sometimes there is a question around academic strengths and where students are ready to learn. Since the beginning of CTD, almost 45 years ago, we've engaged in above grade level assessment and ways to help students and families and educators really better understand the level of knowledge that they have and what they're ready to learn next. So if anybody's interested in that, to go to our website to look for CTD assessment. We have assessments online throughout the year, so you don't even have to physically travel somewhere anymore to do that. The summer programs are currently enrolling. We have classes for students as young as age 4 all the way through high school. Usually 1 or 3 week iterations of these courses. The younger students are either at St. Athanasius here in Evanston, or they are at South Loop Middle School. And I think I have a slide on that. But 1 week enrichment classes for them throughout the summer on campus, grades 6 through 12. They have a residential option to be, taking their class. They study one subject for either 1 week or 3 weeks, so they can go pretty in depth in a 3 week class. If they need an AP or an honors high school credit, this is, a place that they can do that as well. We also have online programming for students. So again, the duration of the programs, the focus of them varies by age, but online throughout the year and during the summer, both enrichment and credit-bearing options for students. When we say online family program for age 4 to grade 3, I know there's sometimes like, well, what is no, we're not putting 4-year-olds on online on the computer to do lessons. The online family really is about, there's a teacher that CTD has that has created and curated some activities that families get to do at home. And it actually is designed to do some of the things that I've mentioned, observe your child, engage and play with them. But then by the time they get older, into 3rd grade and up, they are taking more asynchronous learning courses, for enrichment into a subject that they maybe don't get to study in depth as often. Or, as they get to high school, if they need a credit or a more accelerated course, we have those options as well. If you're here in the Evanston area, we run our weekend program, fall, winter, spring, here on the Northwestern campus. And in the winter, we're also at Bronzeville Classical in Chicago. So again, just a chance for students over 6 weeks to dig more deeply into subjects that they love. And then we do have a very specific leadership and service learning strand of our programming. And those happen year-round, either online or in person. And our students are coming together to really think about, what are some of the issues and concerns of our problems or within the different domains that they study, and building skills specific to becoming a leader in the many forms that will take. And then new this year, we're excited to be working with Nexcellence around sort of research skills and helping students middle and high school. They can spend 3 weeks on campus with us to learn a little bit more about how how research gets conducted, putting their idea together, putting that project together in a very supportive environment. So we are just about to the end there. So I'll stop with that piece and just make sure there aren't any additional questions that we need to address before we wrap up.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing those great resources from CTD, Susan. It looks like we don't have any additional questions, so that brings us to the end of our session today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and participating in the chat and asking such thoughtful questions. And thank you again to Susan for the wonderful presentation.
Sure.
This webinar was part of a three-part series hosted in partnership with the Center for Talent Development. In this evidence-based series, experts from CTD shared how talent develops over time and how parents and caregivers can actively support that development in children under 18. We encourage you to register for the upcoming session on April 8th. We'll go ahead and drop that registration in the chat.
Yes, this will be with my colleague, Denise Mitko, who is fantastic. So I encourage you to join her if you can.
Yeah, no, we're super excited for the session. And then to find out about more alumni events, please check out the NIA website at alumni.northwestern.edu. With that, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and go
Thank you.
Cats.